Welcome to Rise Leaders Radio. I'm your host, Leanne Mallory. As a leadership coach, I work inside organizations and I focus on helping leaders achieve their whole person potential and meaningfully contribute to their organization's mission. With this podcast, I share leadership best practices, developmental approaches, and stories of exemplary leaders. Greetings. Today I'm doing something a little different, although it does harken back to episode 18 when I was talking about poetry. Today I'm going to give you the gift of a poem, and the name of this poem is Hokusai Says. But before I get into it, I just want to say a little bit about why poetry and why on this podcast, which is about exemplary leadership. Any kind of art, whether it's poetry, painting, sculpture, whatever that may be, has the ability to put us in a different frame of mind, give us a different perspective, and see the world through another person's lens. And in fact, a person who's spent a lot of time thinking and interpreting the world in a certain way. It's typically not logical or rational or linear in the way that it's written or the way that it's painted. It's more associative. It's complex, and we really have to use our imagination muscle to determine our own meaning. So that's another thing I like about it, is that we get to interpret it in our way. This particular poem, I read a lot at commencements, and I mean commencements of actually leadership programs. And I like it because I find it inspiring. It's very human. It's grounding, and it reminds me of what we can be, a little bit about the poem and about the poet. So Hokusai, Hokusai, was maybe the most prolific Japanese artist. He was alive from 1760 to 1849, and his most popular series is called 36 Views of Mount Fuji. And if you do a search for the Great Wave of Kanagawa, you might even find that you've seen this piece of art before. So that's Hokusai. The poet is Roger S. Keyes, and he's not someone that I had ever heard about, and maybe you haven't either. He is an art historian. He specializes in Japanese art, and after years of studying Hokusai's art, he wrote this poem as his own interpretation of what Hokusai was saying all those years through his art. So I hope you enjoy. In the episode notes, I'll put a link to a guide I created a while back called A Guide to Reading Poetry. Basically, just give yourself some time to relax into listening to this poem, perhaps listening to it a couple of times and doing some reflection on what this reminds you of, what meaning it has for you, and maybe even if it inspires you to action. Enjoy. Hokusai Says by Roger S. Keyes. Hokusai says, look carefully. He says, pay attention. Notice. He says, keep looking, stay curious. He says there is no end to seeing. He says look forward to getting old. He says keep changing. You just get more who you really are. He says get stuck, accept it, repeat yourself as long as it is interesting. He says keep doing what you love. He says keep praying. He says, every one of us is a child. Every one of us is ancient. Every one of us has a body. He says, every one of us is frightened. He says every one of us has to find a way to live with fear. He says everything is alive. Shells, buildings, people, fish, mountains, trees, wood is alive. Water is alive. Everything has its own life. Everything lives inside us. He says, live with the world inside you. He says it doesn't matter if you draw or write books. It doesn't matter if you saw wood or catch fish. It doesn't matter if you sit at home and stare at the ants on your veranda or the shadows of the trees and grasses in your garden. It matters that you care. It matters that you feel. It matters that you notice. It matters that life lives through you. Contentment is life living through you. Joy is life living through you. Satisfaction and strength is life living through you. He says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Love, feel, let life take you by the hand. Let life live through you. Take a moment and notice the poem's impact on you, any reflections that you're having, and know that you can find the poem and a guide for reading poetry in the episode notes. Thanks for listening, and I hope you have a beautiful day. If you like what you heard today, subscribe to Rise Leaders Radio on your preferred podcast platform. Your ratings, reviews, and shares are also really appreciated. You can also visit rise-leaders.com for all the resources we talked about today and to work with me if you're committed to making your unique and positive impact. Thank you for listening, and remember, elevate your part of the world.